Have you ever wondered what life was really like for the Celts? Imagine a time centuries ago when everything about the world was mysterious, wild, and filled with danger. In a world where superstition, strange rituals, and supernatural beliefs were all part of everyday life, the Celts thrived, embracing customs and practices that may seem utterly bizarre or even creepy by modern standards. Now, picture this. Ancient rituals involving fire, death, sacrifice, and spirits, all deeply woven into the Celtic way of life. Some of these practices might send chills down your spine. Yet, for the Celts, they were as normal as eating dinner or going to battle. They didn't know the world the way we do. Instead, they lived in a realm where the line between the living and the dead was blurred, and every stone, tree, and river held spiritual significance. In today's video, we're going to dive deep into the eeriest practices and customs of Celtic tribes that were completely normal to them, but are downright creepy when we look at them from the outside. You'll hear about bizarre rituals, ghostly beliefs, and chilling practices that will leave you questioning how they ever saw the world the way they did. Before you click away thinking you've heard it all, stick with me for a moment. Some of the customs we're about to explore are so shocking and strange that you'll be amazed they were part of everyday life for the Celts. From blood-curdling sacrifices to supernatural spirits, this is a part of history that is rarely talked about in such detail. By the time you finish watching this video, you'll have a new understanding of just how strange and yet fascinating the world of the Celts really was. So make sure you stay tuned till the end because we have some truly shocking revelations coming up. Trust me, you don't want to miss a single moment. The Celts lived in a time where the supernatural ruled every aspect of their lives. This was long before modern medicine, technology, or even widespread written history. The Celts lived closely with nature, relying on their deep connection to the earth, the trees, the rivers, and the sky to guide them in everything they did. The most important part of their belief system was a spiritual world, an invisible realm filled with gods, spirits, and otherworldly creatures. This belief was so ingrained in their culture that practices we would now consider dark, eerie, or even downright creepy were not just accepted. They were essential to their survival and spiritual well-being. Let's explore the creepiest things that the Celts considered completely normal. 1. Human sacrifice as a ritual. One of the creepiest practices the Celts embraced was human sacrifice. Now, we've all heard stories about sacrifices, but for the Celts, this wasn't just an isolated event. It was an integral part of their religious and spiritual life. In times of crisis, or at the height of major festivals like Samhain, which we know today as Halloween, the Celts believed that the gods demanded the ultimate offering, a human life. The sacrifices were made in elaborate ceremonies, often performed by the Druids, the religious leaders of the Celtic tribes. But it wasn't just about killing someone. These sacrifices were carried out in specific rituals, some of which included the infamous Wicker Man. The Wicker Man was a huge effigy made of twigs and branches, sometimes in shape of a human, into which a person would be placed. This effigy would then be set on fire, and the person inside would burn alive. The Celts believed that burning the person in such a way would ensure that the gods would send rain, good harvests, or victory in battle. They also believed that the sacrifice sent the victim's soul to the gods, keeping their gods satisfied and their lands fertile. In some cases, it was not always criminals who were sacrificed. In some Celtic traditions, warriors or high-status individuals might volunteer themselves for sacrifice, believing that it would grant them favor in the afterlife. This ritual might sound disturbing to us, but for the Celts, it was a necessary and sacred act to keep their world in balance. 2. The Druids' power and dark practices. The Druids were the spiritual powerhouses of the Celtic world. They weren't just priests and healers. They were leaders, lawmakers, and even political advisors. But the Druids also wielded dark magic, connecting them to forces beyond the physical world. They were known for their ability to control nature, forecast the future, and even communicate with the dead. The Druids had a reputation for being able to wield mysterious powers, ones that outsiders considered to be dark and dangerous. To practice their magic, Druids would often enter deep trances, either induced by natural hallucinogens or spiritual rituals, to access other realms and commune with gods and spirits. Their role in the tribe was pivotal, but their practices often involved things that were unsettling, even by ancient standards. For example, Certain rituals involved the use of human remains, believed to enhance the spiritual potency of their ceremonies. In these rituals, bones or ashes of ancestors or enemies were sometimes used as magical tools. These practices made the Druid seem both awe-inspiring and terrifying to the average Celtic tribesman. Druids also played a part in large public rituals, where they could call upon divine forces or the spirits of the dead. They believed that spirits of the departed could interact with the living during special festivals, like Samhain, when the veil between the worlds was thinnest. These spirits weren't always friendly, and appeasing them was considered crucial. The Druids' powers and their connection to the spirit world made them a formidable force, and they were both revered and feared in equal measure. 3. Head hunting. Head hunting was another practice that might seem bizarre to us, but was entirely normal for the Celts. The Celts, like many ancient tribes, believed that a person's soul resided in their head. Therefore, taking an enemy's head during battle wasn't just a trophy. It was a way to capture their strength, courage, and spirit. After a successful battle, the victorious warrior would often sever the heads of his enemies and take them back to their tribe as symbols of strength and power. These severed heads were displayed as a sign of the warrior's prowess and sometimes even preserved. Warriors would sometimes go to great lengths to ensure that the head was properly preserved, making sure that the skull remained intact. These trophies were kept in homes or hung outside the warrior's dwellings. The more heads a warrior collected, the more powerful they were seen to be. Not only did this practice serve as a show of power, but it was also believed that taking an enemy's head could allow a warrior to absorb their power. This wasn't just an act of brutality. It was also deeply spiritual, as the Celts believed in the idea that the soul was bound to the head. 4. The wild hunt. The wild hunt is one of the most chilling aspects of Celtic mythology. This was the idea that during certain times of the year, particularly winter, the dead, or even gods would ride across the skies in a ghostly procession known as the wild hunt. The leader of this hunt was often a god or a powerful warrior, and the rest of the group could include both living humans and spirits of the dead. The Celts believed that when the wild hunt appeared, it was an omen of disaster, death, or chaos. Villagers would often fear the coming of the wild hunt, believing that it would bring destruction or that it was a sign that someone in the village would soon die. The hunt was particularly associated with Samhain, when the boundary between the worlds of the living and the dead was said to be thinnest. During this time, spirits would walk among the living, and the wild hunt was seen as a procession of those spirits making their way through the mortal world. The sound of the hunt, the galloping of horses and the cries of the riders, was said to echo through the forests, sending shivers down the spines of those who heard it. 5. The belief in fairies and spirits. The Celts were deeply connected to the supernatural world, believing that fairies, spirits, and otherworldly beings populated the earth around them. But these were no ordinary fairies. These were powerful, often malevolent beings, capable of causing illness, bad luck, or even death. The Celts believed that these spirits could cross into the mortal realm at will, particularly during times of ritual or festivals like Samhain. Fairies, often known as the good people, were thought to live in the other world, a parallel realm that overlapped with the human world. However, crossing into this realm was dangerous, and the Celts took care not to anger these beings. Offerings were made of fairies and spirits in order to keep them content. Failure to do so could lead to a visit from a vengeful fairy or spirit, resulting in misfortune for the person involved. Some of these fairies could shapeshift, making them even more terrifying. The idea of fairies as mischievous, yet dangerous beings was a deeply ingrained part of Celtic life. 6. Death and the afterlife. The Celts viewed death not as an end, but as a transition. They believed that after death, the soul journeyed to the other world, a mystical realm that was often depicted as both a place of peace and a place full of adventure. However, it wasn't a peaceful rest. Instead, souls in the other world continued to live, interact, and even influence the living world. The Celts believed that the dead could return to the mortal realm during certain times of the year, especially around Samhain. It was during this festival that the boundary between the living and the dead was thinnest, allowing spirits to walk among the living. To prepare for death, the Celts had specific rituals. They would offer food, drink, and even personal belongings to the deceased, believing these items would help the departed on their journey. When someone died, The Celts would hold a wake to celebrate their life and help guide their soul to the afterlife. 7. Rituals around the harvest and the changing of seasons. The Celts held an intimate connection to the land, and their rituals were often deeply tied to the seasons. The cycle of nature, birth, growth, death, and rebirth, was reflected in their religious practices. The changing of the seasons marked important points in their spiritual calendar, and each season was linked to specific deities and spirits. For the Celts, the most important festivals were those that aligned with the agricultural year, such as Imbolc, which marked the beginning of spring, Beltane, celebrating fertility and the arrival of summer, Lammas, the first harvest, and Samhain, the end of the harvest and the beginning of winter. Each of these festivals involved rituals that not only honor their gods, but also sought to ensure bountiful crops and prosperity. However, some of these rituals were a little unsettling. The harvest festival, particularly Lammas, was a time when the Celts believed that the earth itself had to be honored for providing the bounty of the crops. This ritual often involved symbolic acts, such as the sacrifice of animals or offerings of grain, milk, and other food. The most unsettling aspect of these festivals was a belief that to ensure a good harvest in the coming year, a part of the community's fertility or strength must be sacrificed. Sometimes, these rituals took on a more disturbing aspect when certain individuals, especially those seen as unfit for society, were sacrificed to the earth, ensuring that nature would continue to be kind. For the Celts, these practices were not seen as cruel. They were believed to be acts of communion with the land, gods, and spirits to keep the natural world in balance. However, for us today, it can be difficult to imagine a world where the very success of the harvest relied on these supernatural rites. 8. The Celtic burial customs and their unique views on death. The way the Celts handled death was far from ordinary. For many of us, death is a final end, an irreversible separation from a world. But for the Celts, death was simply another transition. Their burial practices reflected their belief in the continuity of life, both on this earth and in the afterlife. The Celts did not always bury their dead in the way other ancient cultures did. Instead, many Celts practiced cremation, burning the bodies of the deceased in large funeral pyres. The bones of the dead were often gathered and placed in urns, which were sometimes buried or kept in sacred spaces. This cremation practice symbolized the release of the spirit from the physical world, allowing it to pass into the afterlife. But it wasn't just the body that mattered. Some Celts believed that important objects or personal belongings of the deceased were necessary for their journey into the afterlife. Warriors, for example, were often buried with weapons, armor, and other items they might need in the afterlife. Another notable burial custom was construction of barrows or burial mounds. These mounds were often quite elaborate, sometimes containing intricate stone chambers, where the dead were placed along with personal items and treasures. Some of these burial mounds, such as the famous Newgrange in Ireland, align with the solstices, indicating the Celts' deep connection to both the seasons and the cosmos. To the Celts, these burial sites were more than just places of the dead. They were portals to the other world, where spirits continued their existence and interacted with the living. In some cases, particularly for leaders or royalty, the burial sites became elaborate tombs where the deceased were prepared for a journey to the afterlife. This belief in an afterlife wasn't just about the destination. It was about the idea that death was a continuation of a warrior's journey. The Celts didn't fear death. They embraced it as a natural part of life. Their burial rituals reflected this, ensuring that those who passed would be honored in a way that facilitated their journey. 9. The role of women in Celtic spirituality and society. While we often think of ancient cultures as being patriarchal, the Celts had a unique approach to gender roles, especially when it came to spiritual matters. Women in Celtic society played a significant role, not only in the household, but also in religious and spiritual rituals. This wasn't just a culture of men fighting in battles and women raising children. Women were seen as powerful figures, especially when it came to spiritual leadership. In Celtic mythology, women were often portrayed as fierce warriors, wise leaders, and even goddesses. One of the most well-known figures in Celtic mythology is the warrior queen Boudica, who led a revolt against the Romans. But beyond mythology, real women were also deeply involved in the religious and spiritual life of the Celts. Some of the most important druids were women. and these women held authority in the same way their male counterparts did. These women were believed to have the ability to communicate with spirits and access the other world. In fact, many Celtic rituals and ceremonies, especially those performed during festivals like Beltane and Samhain, would involve both men and women in positions of leadership. The Celts believed that women were closer to the mystical realm of spirits, nature, and fertility. Certain women, known as witches or wise women, were known for their ability to predict the future, heal with herbs, and engage in magical rituals. In fact, many of the dark practices we associate with witches today can be traced back to the Celtic tradition of female spiritual leadership. These women were seen as protectors of the tribe's spiritual health and were often consulted during times of uncertainty, such as during wars or bad harvests. 10. The gods and goddesses of the Celtic pantheon. The Celts had a pantheon of gods and goddesses that were central to their spiritual life. These deities weren't abstract or distant. They were believed to be real, present, and influential in the daily lives of the people. The Celtic gods and goddesses were associated with everything from war and fertility to the land and the harvest. They were deeply integrated into the Celts' rituals, festivals, and sacrifices. The most famous of these gods was the god Cernunnos, the horn god, who was associated with fertility, animals, and the hunt. Cernunnos was often depicted with antlers and was considered the guardian of the natural world. He was a symbol of life and death, as the cycles of nature mirrored the Celts' beliefs about the afterlife. Other gods, like the war goddess Morrigan, were deeply tied to the concept of battle, death, and the supernatural. The Morrigan was a terrifying figure, often associated with ravens, and was said to appear on the battlefield to either aid or curse warriors. She represented both life and death, a duality that was central to the Celtic worldview. The Celts also worshipped deities associated with specific aspects of nature, like rivers, trees, and mountains. These gods and goddesses were seen as guardians of the land, and many rituals were performed at natural sites, such as groves, sacred wells, and rivers, where the Celts believed the gods were present. These sites were often used for sacrifices, prayers, and other rituals that sought to maintain the balance between the human and divine realms. 11. The role of omens and superstitions in Celtic life. The Celts were deeply attuned to signs and omens in nature, believing that everything from birds' flight to the positions of the stars could offer insights into the future. Druids, trained to interpret these omens, would examine signs like the flight of a raven over a battlefield, signifying either victory or impending death. Changes in weather or sightings of certain animals could indicate war or disaster. These omens weren't taken lightly. They played a crucial role in guiding the tribe's decisions. A warrior might hesitate to battle if he saw a bad omen, and a king could delay significant actions based on celestial signs. For the Celts, these signs were a way to understand the forces beyond their control and ensure survival. As we've explored, the Celts saw the world through a spiritual lens, where the supernatural was just as real as the physical world. Their practices, though strange to us today, were vital to their understanding of life, death, and the forces that govern their existence. What do you think? Were the Celts simply ahead of their time, or were their customs truly disturbing? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more fascinating history. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.